You know, many say that we are living in a time of crisis. And recently, back at the house, my family's been reading a book called The Quest for Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon and the Church of Rome. And we thought, I was just thinking, golly gee whiz, this is a time when Catholics were, no doubt, living in great crisis. How did they do that? How did they live their life? How did they maintain their faith? How did they avoid the worst possible consequences? And so we've invited Joseph Pearce, the author of that book and many other books, actually, to be on the show to discuss that. Good morning to you, Joseph Pearce.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, praise be to God. We're grateful for your time today. Fantastic book, by the way. You know, I remember the first time someone suggested that William Shakespeare is Catholic, my mind twisted a bit. Like, how is this possible? I'd never heard this before. This seems novel and weird. So let me ask you right out of the gate a question. What is your most compelling? You've written, I think, 3 books. You've taught courses on this. What is your most compelling evidence to suggest that William Shakespeare was, in fact, Catholic?
First thing I would say, Joe, is that I had exactly the same response as you did when I was first told by people that there was evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. I just dismissed it as wishful thinking. But then, as time went on, I kept coming across pieces of evidence, and at some point, I got intrigued enough to start looking for it. And then the books I've written on Shakespeare are the fruit of that. So the biggest, I mean, where does one begin? But for me, I think the most compelling evidence is the last thing that Shakespeare did before retiring from London in 1612, 1613, was to buy the Blackfriars Gatehouse, which was the gatehouse to the Dominican house in London, which was, of course, destroyed by Henry VIII. In the 1530s. But the gatehouse had always remained in Catholic hands. We have the property deeds. Right from those days, Henry VIII, 80 years later, William Shakespeare buys it. That house had been a center for illegal Catholic activity. By illegal, I mean it was illegal to be a priest. It was punishable by death to be a priest. It was punishable by death to hide a priest from the authorities. So this house that was raided on several occasions, we know that priests stayed there, Jesuits stayed there, and it had secret passageways down to the river so that people could escape during such raids. This is the house that Shakespeare buys. Not only does he buy it, he insists that the tenant, John Robinson, who's living there before he buys it, should continue to live there. John Robinson is the only one of Shakespeare's London friends who's with him in his final illness, so he's a close friend. And the same year in which Shakespeare buys that house, John Robinson's brother enters the English College in Rome to study for the priesthood. I mean, I could give other evidence, but there's one little bit of evidence for you.
You know, one thing that whenever I first came across your book, I was in university, I think my junior year of university, and I was taking a course, and I was just came across your book, I started reading it, and I was blown away because I had always been told in high school and in other places that Shakespeare was most likely an atheist. They're like, he never attended church services, and his plays very secular, so not very. He kind of made fun of the supernatural, and so therefore he's not Catholic. He's clearly not Catholic, but he's not religious at all. He's an atheist. So that was a huge shock to me reading your book. I was like, this doesn't compute with anything I've ever been told. And so where did the narrative that he's an atheist come from?
I'm just tempted to say, first of all, that what you've just said just shows that there is blindness, extreme blindness in the modern academy. Because, to say that Shakespeare's an atheist, it goes against all the readings of the play. The other thing I've done in other books is to show the deep Catholicism of the plays. My follow-up book to the book we're discussing this morning is called Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays. And the reason that he's an atheist, he didn't attend church. He didn't attend church for the same reason that his deeply Catholic mother didn't attend church. It's the Anglican church that didn't attend, the state religion that they were refusing to attend. That's why there's no record of Shakespeare attending church, not because he's an atheist, but because he's a Catholic.
Well, let's talk about the plays for a second here. Many have said now that many that are looking at this from a Catholic lens have said he has secretly coded Catholic language, thoughts, and ideas into his works. You've written a couple of books on this point here. What would you say is his most compelling Catholic work in his plays or poems?
Well, I mean, I haven't found one that does not contain a deep Catholic dimension, and most of it's not coded. I mean, I don't actually make that claim specifically. Other writers have done so, and that's fine. I think that Catholicism is much more obvious than that. So let's take Hamlet, for instance, probably his best play. It's all about something rotten in the state of Denmark. Shakespeare's own audience would have known that was something rotten in the state of England. It was also illegal in Shakespeare's time to write about contemporary politics or religion. So what does Shakespeare do? Sets his plays either in Italy or in the past. And of course, in England, you only have to go back 80 years and you've got Catholicism. So that's the way he circumvented that law. And then just before Hamlet was written, they also made it illegal to write plays about English history. So what does Shakespeare do? He writes a play about Danish history, which is basically everyone knows is actually about England. And what's the key thing about it? A spy network, this malicious spy network supporting a murderous king and seeking to put the innocent to death. So that's exactly what's happening in England at the time. England's priests and laity are being betrayed by a network of spies run by the government. And so England, the Shakespeare's audience, that would have been obvious, not coded, but obvious. But of course, he can't talk about England because he would be sent to prison. But you talk about Denmark in the past and about a network of spies, everyone knows what he's talking about. It's exactly the same sort of thing that was done during the Soviet Union by anti-communists with the production of plays there. You're not talking about communism, but you even stage Antigone and everyone knows you're talking about the Soviet Union.
What would you say was Shakespeare's most religious, most Catholic work out of his entire body?
Well, again, it's all of them are Catholic. None of them are obviously so, because for the entirety of Shakespeare's career, the Catholic Church is illegal, except for a very brief period after James I came to the throne, where for about just over a year, religious liberty was restored before it was taken away again. So what we see is that the plays written around that time, one's called All's Well That Ends Well, and I think we might even take the title to speak for itself, and the other is Measure for Measure, where the heroine is a religious sister. And Measure for Measure is probably the most overtly Catholic play, but in many respects, when the persecution returns, he writes plays like Macbeth. Macbeth is a play about a Scottish king. Who's the new king of England? A Scottish king. Again, people would have known that Macbeth is a code name for James. So is it overtly Catholic? No. But does everybody know it's Catholic? Yes.
Well, that brings me into the next question then. If we can look at this and see that and to go, oh, that makes it's obvious. It seems very very obvious to us. What about these Anglicans? What about the Protestants? What about the anti-Catholics of his day and time? Would they not have also seen that Macbeth was very dangerous territory for this guy?
Yes, yeah. I mean, he was being courageous to write that particular play. We have the Ignatius Critical Edition of Macbeth. I write a very long, about 7,000 word introduction on the play. So just people want to dig deeper, they can. We don't have much time here, but the Puritans hated the theatre. There was a Puritan historian called John Speed who talked about the papist and his playwright, and that was a Jesuit priest and Shakespeare. And when the Puritans got enough power after Shakespeare's death, they closed the theatres down. They considered the theatres to be a network of popery, and they were very opposed to it, and they were largely correct.
I think you've written at least 3 books on Shakespeare.
Yes, so I wrote a book, the one you're reading, The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon, The Church of Rome, and that's the historical, biographical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. And I wrote 2 other books, Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays, and then Shakespeare on Love, Seeing the Catholic Presence in Romeo and Juliet. So, yeah, 2 books, and then we've published 7 of Shakespeare's plays in the Ignatius Critical Edition series, each of which I've written the introduction. So yes, I've written quite a bit on Shakespeare over the years.
You know, Edmund Campion played a critical role in the mission and the history of Catholic England, And there was an individual that I have been very fond of retelling his story a number of times when I give public talks, and that's Philip of Arundel. Philip was high in the court of Elizabeth, but he spent 10+ years in the Tower of London, starved to death very slowly, was not allowed to see his wife and children after his reversion, thanks to Edmund Campion. How is it possible that William Shakespeare, writing things like Macbeth, could avoid being captured?
Well, as I say, the best way of understanding that, I think, is to look at someone who's in a very similar position in late Elizabethan England, in Shakespeare's time, basically, a contemporary of Shakespeare, and that's the court composer William Byrd. Some of your listeners will know some of the beautiful music he's written for the Mass. William Byrd was a known recusant Catholic, so not just a Catholic, but a Catholic who refused to attend Anglican services and paid fines. But Queen Elizabeth I liked him. She liked his music. And told her chief lawyer, the Attorney General, to tell the authorities to leave William Byrd alone. So I think that's the scenario we're looking at with William Shakespeare, that he wasn't seen to be a personal threat to the Queen or the King. But on saying that, when the Essex Rebellion happened in 1600, that one of Shakespeare's plays, Richard II, was performed on the night before the rebellion in the hope that it would cause the people to rise up against Elizabeth. So people were certainly aware that his plays were volatile, but he managed somehow to stay the right side of the line. I would say, by the way, though, his father was fined for his Catholic recusancy in 1592 when Shakespeare was writing his plays. And his daughter, Susanna, was also fined for her Catholic recusancy in 1606, the same year in which Shakespeare's writing Macbeth about the Scottish king.
Mr. Pearce, I'm wondering now if that response from the authorities was specifically towards the people with influence. I'm wondering if maybe it was different for other Catholics who maybe weren't so influential. What was their life like day to day? I imagine it would be like being in the upper room.
It is a complex situation. There were many known Catholics in the Queen's court at the end of Elizabeth's reign. So Shakespeare's time, there's so many Catholics in the Queen's court that the church had to issue instructions as to what Catholics in the Queen's court could do and what they couldn't do. So, for instance, they were allowed to go to the Anglican services in the Queen's train, in the Queen's presence, because to refuse to do so would mean execution. But they were not allowed to receive Anglican communion. So, we have to realize a large section of the population was still Catholics. And if they didn't go to Anglican services, they were fined, and these fines were crippling. So that was the worst persecution. So many were forced into exile. But generally speaking, jail and execution was for priests or for those who were caught and found guilty of hiding priests. So if you weren't a priest, and you weren't actually caught hiding a priest, apart from the fines, you would be, left alone. You would be able to carry on.
I read The Hunted Priest. I thought that was just utterly fascinating. The journal of a Jesuit who, born and raised in England, became a priest in Europe and then came back, arrested, Tower of London, escaped by a high wire. I mean, it was great reading, and it's fascinating to see. But one of the things is I see somewhat of a contrast here between the heroic Jesuit stories of trying to create these Catholic centers, the houses, the manors of the rich, converting them, creating opportunities to convert the staff and their families, so whole villages almost. And then, of course, providing the Mass sacraments and whatnot, catechesis. And then but we're talking about the Mass that was said there under the threat of death was the traditional Latin Mass. So the Catholics at the time struggling, that was their tradition, that is their patrimony, that is their history. Fast forward to our day, the Catholics who have come back to the church, they haven't come back with their tradition and patrimony, they've come back with an Anglican use. When did that shift in English history?
Well, actually, this is a very complex question. So basically, in the 19th century, largely because of the Oxford movement, of which John Henry Newman was the leader, there was a move within the Anglican Church to rediscover its Catholic roots. This became known as Anglo-Catholicism. And this was sort of leapfrogging over the whole period of the Reformation and rediscovering the medieval church, which was, of course, Catholic. So the Anglicans tried to try to make the Anglican service as much like the Mass as possible. They argued that the Anglican Church was part of the Catholic Church. But John Henry Newman, who was the leader of that movement, the Oxford movement, through his research of the Church Fathers and history in general, came to the conclusion which the Church had always insisted upon, that the Anglican Church was founded by Henry VIII. It's not a bona fide Catholic Church, and then he follows his conscience and becomes a Catholic. So then you have a whole stream of converts from the Anglican Church coming in from that time onwards. That was 1845 onwards. And then the more recent converts in the Anglican Church are due to modernism and heresy in the Anglican Church, such as a lot of them came in because of the introduction of priestesses. So this is a reaction to modernism. And in fact, that modernism within the Anglican Church can be seen to basically have destroyed it. The Anglican Church is in its death throes, and it was a blessing to the Catholic Church because we've had hundreds of Anglican priests coming over, many of whom have become ordained as Catholic priests, and that's why we have the Ordinariate and the Anglican use Mass now, which is based upon, ironically, the Book of Common Prayer by Thomas Cranmer, who was no friend of the Catholic Church, but a great writer of English. It's very beautiful. But that was amended to make it a bona fide Catholic Mass, and that's what the Ordinariate celebrate.
So during that time period that you're speaking of, whenever John Henry Newman, back before he converted, was revitalizing the Catholic roots of Anglican England, why was there not a resurgence of the Sarum rite and other English rites? Because I remember there being a few English rites, Sarum being the most popular of them. What happened to those? Why did those not get revived instead of bringing the Book of Common Prayer and revitalizing liturgical worship in that sense?
Well, the Book of Common Prayer wasn't brought back until the Ordinariate during the reign of St. John Paul II. So we have to understand that when St. John Henry Newman leaves the Anglican Church, he's leaving a church which is, not the Catholic Church, and then he comes into our church and celebrates the Tridentine Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, that's what everybody was celebrating, certainly in Western Europe at this point. The Sarum rite was, basically killed off essentially by the Reformation, because, the priests obviously became illegal, and those priests that came back into the country were celebrating the Tridentine Mass, the church, the liturgy from Rome, because that's where many of them were coming from, amongst other things, and that had become the standard rite of the Western Church. So the Sarum use, some people still celebrate it now, and obviously it's part of the tradition of the Church, but it effectively was killed off as regards a continuum, a living tradition by the Reformation.
We're down to just a couple of minutes here with Joseph Pearce. Let me ask a follow-up question on going back to Shakespeare here for a second. How often would he have gone to Catholic Mass?
Well, it's not. It's impossible to know, because the whole point about such a time, it's like, again, the Soviet Union, people don't leave a paper trail, right? Mm-hmm. You don't tell people you're going to Mass, because that's basically going to guarantee you go to prison. But we do know that he was close to the Jesuit martyr St. Robert Southwell. There are all sorts of evidence for that historically, biographically, and textually from the plays. So Robert Southwell ministered to England's Catholics in London, where Shakespeare was living. And I find it unbelievable to believe anything other than, if he's close to St. Robert Southwell, he's also actually attending masses and the sacraments when St. Robert Southwell makes it available. But is there any evidence of that? No. But is there any evidence of St. Robert Southwell ever celebrating Mass during his 6 years before he's arrested? No. But no one's going to say that St. Robert Southwell, a Jesuit priest, had come back to England, putting his life on the line, if it wasn't primarily to offer the sacraments to the people.
You know, just to sort of wrap this up, because we're coming down to the wire here, is many people that believe that we are living at a time of crisis, and these Catholics in that time were definitely living at a time of crisis, yet they seem to do extraordinary things to ensure that they could continue to live the Catholic faith, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think times of persecution are times of opportunity. They're times when we are called to be martyrs and witnesses, whatever sort of martyrdom is called of us. And it's what sorts out the wheat from the chaff. You know, fair weather Catholics will disappear when the going gets tough, and it will be a purification of the church. The church will be smaller in terms of number, not as Pope Benedict XVI said, it'll be the mustard seed church. And times of persecution are always times of purification. And you know, after every death of the church, there's a resurrection of the church. So we need to be able to see our own times within the context of all times, 2,000 years of church history. And that allows us to see our own times in context, and far from despairing, to glorify the Lord. And to know, of course, the end of the world for us is when we die. So that's the finishing line we need to be keeping our eye on at all times.
Yeah, we don't know if we're going to make it even through the day, I guess, you know. Praise be to God. Joseph Pearce, the author of The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon, and The Church of Rome. When you wrote that book, I don't know, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago?
Like 15 years ago now.
Is it really that old? 15 years. Wow. You can get it actually for under $17 right now at Ignatius.com. You should check it out. It's a great book. Family's enjoying it. The Quest for Shakespeare at Ignatius.com. Joseph Pearce, God bless you. God love you. Thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. God bless you.
We look forward to having you back soon. All right, that's going to do it for hour number 1. If you can join us in the second hour, we're going to catch up with attorney Brent Haynes on some big stories, big pro-life stories. All that and more coming up in the next hour. Otherwise, we'll see you back here tomorrow. Don't forget, grnonline.com.